Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephanie, and I'm the Community Planning Advisor at the EFCL. We're also joined by the EFCL's Executive Director, Laura Cunningham-Chaplay, who will be assisting us with our group discussions tonight. So before we jump into the content, I wanted to go over how the session is going to work today. So it'll be digitally recorded so that we're able to share a video with people who are unable to attend. However, we will not be digitally recording the group discussion. Instead, whichever EFCL staff is in your room with you will just take some general notes that can be then provided to the EFCL's Planning and Development Committee. Excuse me. The second is that participants will remain on mute except for when the group discussion occurs. So because we don't have a ton of time today, what we'll ask you to do is if you do have any questions, post them in the chat and we'll make a master document of all the questions that come up with answers that can be sent to participants following the last session. And I also want to note that the content presented in this webinar is derived directly from the discussion papers and does not necessarily reflect the opinions of the EFCL. We just felt it was important to host these webinars so that folks who don't have time to sit down and read, 4 30-page papers still benefit from the information shared in the papers and are prepared for the upcoming proposals that we'll start seeing in 2021. So the latest batch of discussion papers is the final batch to be released by the Zoning Bylaw team, and they include information about residential zoning, notifications and variances, civic service zones, and signs. So we'll talk about 1 through 3, but we won't have time to get to signs tonight. So in the slide deck that I send out to you following the presentation, I will include a few explanatory slides on signs for those of you who are interested in learning more. And so up until this point, we've been told that the papers are exploratory and that outcomes have yet to be determined. However, the papers do give a fairly clear understanding of the direction the renewal project is going as a whole. So with that said, the city is still very keen to hear your feedback on their proposals and have set up a platform at engage.edmonton.ca where you can read the full papers and share your feedback with the team working on this project through forums and surveys. The EFCL also hosts a webinar on the previous batch of discussion papers, which can be viewed on our YouTube at the EFCL. I've also posted an introductory video that we prepared to give you a 10-minute overview of why the city is renewing the bylaw and the principles that will be guiding that work. If you haven't watched that video yet, I highly encourage you to do so following this presentation, as we don't have time to get into it tonight, but it's still some interesting content that will better allow you to understand where this project is moving. So with all of the housekeeping out of the way, let's jump into the first paper, which is the residential discussion paper. So the purpose of this paper is to describe how the residential zones and the new bylaw can support Edmonton's residential neighborhoods as they evolve over time and make it easier for residents to access housing and more services and amenities closer to where they live. So the paper describes 4 ways that the new bylaw can help further those goals. The first being to simplify and reduce overlap between zones by consolidating the existing 15 standard zones into 2 residential zones. The second is providing more room for diverse housing types and more units across the city. The third is advancing the concept of 15-minute districts where a person's everyday needs can be accessed in a 15-minute walk, which will be enabled by allowing more types of activities and uses closer to where people live. And finally, the new bylaw can help further these goals by enabling designs that are flexible and compatible with their surroundings. So essentially the driver for these discussions is that in Edmonton, there's a pretty stark lack of housing choice. Half of our housing stock is made up of single detached housing, with apartments, row housing, and semi-detached housing all combining together to make up the other half. So single detached housing does remain the preferred housing type that people want to live in, but there are a ton of factors, including and especially affordability, that influence whether single family housing is attainable for even moderate income households. Now more than ever, there is a great demand for rental housing, particularly units that are priced in the mid-range and larger apartment units that can accommodate families with children. The demand for rental housing is being driven both by new people arriving in Edmonton and by people who are renting longer than ever before, because the transition to homeownership is hard to come by due to affordability issues if they're ever even able to make the transition at all. There's a huge push also for seniors to have access to affordable and diverse housing, such as housing for intergenerational living, smaller units for seniors who wish to downsize or reduce costs, rental units in suburban settings, and mixed-use housing near services and amenities. And so all of those scenarios speak to a need to provide more affordable housing, but they're still talking about what we call market rate housing. So there are still thousands of individuals in Edmonton who have difficulty affording market rate housing, which leaves many people vulnerable or even without a home. So the draft city plan, which is basically guiding this entire project, does have a variety of targets and policy directives that will influence the new zoning bylaw and residential zoning. And these targets are a community of communities, which will be achieved by the 15-minute district concept that we'll discuss in more detail later. The next is inclusive and compassionate, which is the target to ensure that no Edmontonian is in the core housing need, which means everyone is able to spend less than 30% of their pre-tax income to pay for housing. So what will this look like on the ground? This will mean building more types of housing across the entire city, including non-market or subsidized housing, supportive housing, and collective housing, so that everybody has a place to call home. And the final target from the city plan that will influence how residential zones in the new bylaw are written is the notion of a rebuildable city. So basically this means that we need to welcome 600,000 new residents to live within the Anthony Henday Ring Road. This means that already built out neighborhoods will have to adapt and change and grow over time so that 50% of all new housing can be built within this area. So these targets give some ideas about what Edmonton's neighborhoods need to provide as the city grows to its population target of 2 million. And the draft city plan also has some clear directions on how these targets can be achieved through changes to the zoning bylaw. So those three targets will be translated in the new bylaw by creating a more permissible environment for housing to be built everywhere. The draft city plan does focus much of the residential growth within the nodes and corridors areas where the taller and denser buildings are expected to be located along major streets. The city did release a really great paper that describes the nodes and corridor concept in more detail, tons of great maps that you can have a look at. So I really encourage you to do that. And we did go over nodes and corridors in our last webinar, so you can also check that out. But residential areas will still see some redevelopment to welcome more housing, including townhouses, small apartment buildings, tiny homes, courtyard communities, and other new types of housing that may not yet exist. And the new bylaw will also provide opportunities for small-scale businesses to open up in residential communities to help ensure residents can meet their basic needs locally. So in Edmonton's older neighborhoods, there's often a small collection of locally serving businesses and commercial spaces. In this screen grab here, we see such a place in a neighborhood called King Edward Park. So these places currently provide some basic needs to residents and provide gathering spaces. In this grab here, you can see that there's a pharmacy. I'm also aware that there's a salon, a little Korean restaurant, and a little market that serves some fresh fruits and vegetables. So these places currently provide some basic needs to residents, but they also provide gathering spaces for residents. And the intention is to find more opportunities to strengthen these areas to evolve into true local nodes, with new local nodes developing over time. And finally, the new bylaw will emphasize the importance of design. So how new residential buildings are designed and existing ones can be improved, can ensure that residents of all ages and abilities in Edmonton are able to easily access housing and local services in their neighborhoods. So another target is that, another policy directive is that we're going to need more housing everywhere. Edmonton's older neighborhoods are currently seeing properties being redeveloped to include a wider variety of housing types, including garden suites, row housing, secondary suites and basements, and small apartment buildings. And while most people are familiar with single detached, semi-detached, and duplex housing, there could be a wider range of housing types offered within Edmonton's residential neighborhoods than are commonly found today. So the diagram on your screen now shows a few examples of other ways that housing can be configured on a lot that differs from what we typically see. And these types of housings may be contemplated in the new bylaw, because proposed residential zones are intended to allow many different housing options, from market rate housing to supportive housing to affordable housing of all sizes and shapes to be built in Edmonton's neighborhoods. So the concept of 15-minute districts, essentially, in order to allow residents to meet their basic needs within 15 minutes of their homes, the new bylaw will need to allow more types of activities and uses to occur closer to where people live. So the paper does discuss some actions that could help enable this goal, such as opening up opportunities for small-scale businesses to organically grow in neighborhoods, with some locational requirements built in to ensure the businesses are appropriately located. The paper also talks about creating more opportunities within neighborhoods for connection and support, such as parks, community gathering spaces, places of worship, and cafes. And especially important in advancing the concept of 15-minute districts is actually allowing enough people to live in the neighborhood to make efficient use of transit and public utilities and other services, and to patronize those new businesses. And this can be achieved through constructing housing that accommodates the needs and ability of all of our residents. And finally, to achieve the draft city plan's target to accommodate 50% of Edmonton's future growth through redevelopment, it's proposed that the new bylaw will be more flexible in the type of residential building that could be built on a given site. We kind of touched on that on the slide where we saw different ways that housing could be configured on existing lots. So the current bylaw controls how housing is built through regulations such as setbacks from the property line, height limits, site coverage limits, and some design criteria along with landscaping requirements. And the proposed residential zones will continue to regulate the size and shape of buildings as well as other elements of the property. However, the objective of these regulations is not to dictate a particular design or architectural style, but to ensure that whatever is built is compatible with its surroundings. So in this instance, the paper is very clear that compatibility does not mean the same as. Compatibility means that the form, scale, and mass of buildings in a given zone is generally similar, and that the activities that are allowed in these buildings do not create undue impacts on their surroundings. So as we mentioned at the very beginning, it's proposed that the existing 15 residential zones will be consolidated into 2. I know that seems overwhelming, but there is a ton of overlap in those existing zones. So the first zone that they are proposing is called the small-scale residential zone, which would apply to most residential areas in the city. So at present, most residential areas in the city allow for homes up to 3 stories in height. However, the types of homes you can build are restricted depending on what zone you're in. So generally speaking, most low-density residential zones currently permit the housing types shown in the red rectangle on the screen to be built within them. So this ranges anywhere from tiny homes to duplexes. And the new small-scale residential zone would expand what's permitted in the low-density residential zone to include some row housing and small apartment buildings up to 3 stories in height as well. So you'll recall that most residential zones allow for homes up to 3 stories, but they only allow density up to a duplex. So this would expand this zone to include some small apartments that would still only be 3 stories in height. So essentially, the low density zones will be collapsed into one zone called the small scale residential zone to allow for a wider range of housing types to be built across the city to address some of the challenges of affordability we discussed earlier in the presentation. The second zone is the low-rise residential zone, which allows for more dense housing types ranging from 4plexes to mid-rise apartments up to 6 stories. In general, the regulations will mirror those that are found in the medium-scale residential zones, and the size of the building will be controlled through the use of floor area ratio, which limits how big a building can be based on the total amount of floor space compared to the size of the site. So what we have been told is that at this point, what will happen when they go to rezone the entire city is that they'll generally be doing a like-for-like replacement. So the zones that you see in red on the screen here, the RF5, RF6, RA7, and RA8 would be rezoned to the low-rise residential zone. And areas from the previous slide that are zoned RF1, RF2, RF3, and RF4 would be rezoned to the small-scale residential zone we talked about on the previous slide. So there wouldn't be a ton of upzoning happening. Essentially, you'll get like for like with a little bit of increased density through row housing and low-rise apartment buildings in the small-scale residential zone. So there is an additional layer of complexity to the introduction of these new zones. The mature neighborhood overlay is used to regulate residential development in Edmonton's mature residential neighborhoods. And an overlay is an additional set of rules applied to a defined area, and that defined area in this instance is shown in light green on the map. And these rules are intended to achieve some objectives. So in this case, the objective of the overlay is for new development to respond to the context of surrounding development while maintaining the pedestrian-oriented streetscape. So in a lot of our mature communities, we don't have front-facing garages. Oftentimes there's a lane at the back of the house and the garages face the lane. So this really contributes to a really pleasant pedestrian experience in front of the home that isn't broken up by the interruption of driveways and the potential for interaction between cars and children and parents out walking. So that's just one example. But the discussion paper explains that it may not be possible to retain every single regulation contained in this particular overlay, but that there are some that could be downloaded into the small scale residential zone. So a review of the M&O regulations and further discussions with stakeholders, including community leagues, will determine which of the M&O regulations could be incorporated into the small scale residential zone and which may need to be revised or removed because they do not align with objectives to increase housing opportunity. So another example is that in areas that are governed by the mature neighborhood overlay, housing is only permitted to be 8.9 meters tall, which roughly equates to about 2.5 stories. However, in the new small scale residential zone, housing would be allowed to be up to 10 meters in height, which equates to 3 stories to allow for the development of small apartment buildings. So that's about a half-story difference that we see between the mature neighborhood overlay and what's being proposed for the low-rise residential zone. So that brings us to the end of the first paper and into our first discussion. What I'll do is I'll randomly sort you into 2 rooms and you'll have 15 minutes to discuss the proposals you just learned about with regards to residential zoning. And the EFCL staff member on hand will be recording some of your comments and you'll get a 1-minute warning before you're brought back to the main presentation. And also don't feel like you're married to these questions. We just want to create an open space for dialogue. So anything that caught your attention, feel free to make comments about. We'll just be sharing these comments with our Planning and Development Committee so that they know how to support you going forward in this process. All right, so thank you everyone for participating in those discussions. What we'll do is we'll jump into the next paper dealing with open space and civic service zones. So in the context of this paper, open spaces are defined as parks, natural areas, and the North Saskatchewan River Valley and ravine system. Civic services, on the other hand, describe a type of land use and development that serves the broader community and is often located on that parkland. So civic services are things like schools and libraries, police and fire, rec centers, and transit centers. And so the renewal of the zoning bylaw provides the opportunity for civic services to better integrate within communities as guided by policy directives in the draft city plan. So again, the role of the zoning bylaw will be to translate these policy directives into functional zones and regulations so that they better serve the residents of Edmonton. So what are the policy directives for parks and open space in particular? So the first is to protect and enhance natural systems through substantial addition of trees to the city's urban forest, the protection of ecological function, and the preservation of the river valley by directing the responsible movement of people through it and limiting development within it. The second is to ensure open space is welcoming, inclusive, and accessible for all by supporting and encouraging community-led programming, wayfinding, and placemaking to transform these spaces into year-round places for all Edmontonians and visitors. The third is by honoring Indigenous connections to the river valley, and the zoning bylaw will address this by respecting the rights, cultural practices, and activities of Indigenous peoples within natural areas, and by removing regulations that have had unintended social impacts on Indigenous peoples' rights and cultural practices. And finally, the last directive for parks and open space in particular is to support development that is sensitive to nature by ensuring areas of the river valley and ravine system will continue to be dedicated for ecological preservation and conservation, but at the same time enhancing access in select areas which may lead to a little bit more development. So the draft city plan also identifies a number of policy objectives directly related to civic services and how those civic services can support healthy and adaptable communities. So the first one is that it can enable diverse communities and support economic and community investment and innovation through making these zones more inclusive by allowing a greater mix of uses where appropriate. So in general, in civic service zones, there isn't a lot of opportunity for, small commercial development, which can make these places more active and more animated year-round. And the second is that the draft city plan policies recognize the importance of empowering businesses and communities and enabling them to thrive through initiatives, investment, and innovation. The new bylaw can support these policies by including a broad range of uses and expanding opportunities for civic service related uses in these zones. So the management of Edmonton's parks and open space is actually really complex, and it involves a wide range of municipal departments, if you can believe it. But there are, so through conversations with internal stakeholders, they determined that there are a number of issues that have been identified in civic service zones and open space, and those are shown on your screen. But the issue I want to direct your attention to, that I briefly touched upon earlier, is the notion that there's limited opportunity for some commercial amenities in park and open space. So I know, I think it was last year maybe, when the Kalina opened up in Horlick Park, I was just delighted because there wasn't, it seemed like such a missed opportunity for me, you know, like we have this big central park in Edmonton that people come to from all over the city, and there's no place to even, you know, buy a bottle of water or grab a coffee. So when that opened, I was so delighted, so excited. I think through conversations with community leagues, we found that, you know, there is a lot of appetite for, you know, small scale commercial to occur on parkland like that. And which brings me to my next point. So there are tons of community leagues that would like to have access to further revenue generating opportunities, such as leasing a small portion of their community league building or parkland to a business like a cafe, or having a karate class that can operate not as a contracted employee of the league, but just as a person who rents the space and collects the money and, you know, pays the league a small fee. So earlier this year, when the EFCL engaged community leagues on the tripartite agreement, we heard loud and clear that this was an opportunity many leagues were interested in. And following COVID and kind of just a total erasure of any potential for leagues to generate any revenue, we're hearing it again from leagues that this is something that they're really, really interested in. However, there's some barriers. So the first is that much of the parkland in Edmonton is designated as reserve land, and enabling commercial opportunities on this land, we've been told, is a contravention of the Municipal Government Act. So I've just shown you on the screen here, this is the section in question. So you'll see under 6.7.2, there are 4 uses that are contemplated in the Municipal Government Act for how this land can be used. And we have A, a public park, B, a public recreation area, C, school board purposes, or D, to separate areas of land that are used for different purposes. So basically, all of that is to say that because the Act does not contemplate a commercial use on reserve land, it may not be allowed, even though it's totally in line with all of the directives that are coming from the city plan. So therefore, administration says they will consider other potential avenues to permit such requests. However, other agreements, such as the tripartite license agreement, are in effect, and they may require changes in order to align with any new direction to how these lands can be used. The good news is that the tripartite license agreement is currently under review by the city and the EFCL, and the EFCL has had a lot of opportunity to raise some questions about the potential for some commercial or for-profit activities to occur in league spaces. Which brings us to our next discussion. So what are your thoughts on allowing some commercial activities in community leagues, and how might allowing commercial activities in community leagues align with the broader vision for parkland laid out in the new city plan and all of the policy directives that are coming down to guide the zoning bylaw? I just want to hear your thoughts on this. So again, don't feel like you're married to these questions. We can even discuss a little bit about how COVID in particular has impacted revenue streams, and maybe some discussions you've been having at the league level about other ways that the league can generate some revenue and continue to provide programming to the community through that. So again, I'll break you into your rooms, and we'll have about 15 minutes for discussion. All right, thank you again, everyone, for participating. Lots of good discussion there. So the final paper we'll get into, and maybe the most boring, but also really important to community leagues, is the paper on notifications and variances. So in the zoning bylaw, a variance is defined as a deviation from the set of rules a municipality applies to land use and development. A notification, on the other hand, is defined basically as hearing about development in your neighborhood through an official letter from the municipality or those signs that get posted on sites once they've been approved for redevelopment. And we'll begin by talking about variances. So since variances allow projects to be built outside of city established rules, it's important that there is clear guidance for when a variance can be issued. So the city has a really short video which explains this concept that I'm just going to play for you now.
The city of Edmonton stretches across a dynamic landscape complete with flat prairie lands, rolling hills, and an incredible river valley. The variety of our terrain means not every city lot is exactly the same, and accommodating these differences sometimes requires flexibility on specific regulations. When an exception to a regulation is allowed, it's called a variance. Variances are only granted in cases where following the regulation could prevent a safe or functional neighborhood, and the proposed development will not interfere with the enjoyment or value of neighboring properties. Common examples of residential variances include adjustments to setbacks, site width, site coverage, and site area requirements. Learn more about variances and the Mature Neighborhood Overlay online at edmonton.ca/Mature Neighborhood Overlay.
All right, so yeah, it's just a really great little video that kind of visually explains what a variance is, much better than I could do. So variances are one tool that can be used to help enable development, but there are some features of a development that can't be varied, which are shown on your screen. So the uses of a zone can't be varied, the purpose statement of the zone or overlay can't be varied, and the maximum height, maximum floor area ratio, the maximum density cannot be varied, and sometimes the site width, depending on the zone that you're in, cannot be varied. And those rules are in place because variances, they allow for some exceptions to the zoning rules to occur, but they're really not intended to be a tool to accommodate major changes from what is allowed in the zoning bylaw. So depending on the scale of the proposed zoning exceptions, the landowner may need to look at a rezoning, which many community leagues will be familiar with. So the proposed approach for variances, they're seeking to basically expand the criteria with which they can look at a variance for. So administration still has to follow the current existing rules, the provincial rules, when reviewing a variance request for development. However, the new bylaw can include additional criteria to provide more clarity and direction for everyone to understand how a variance request will be evaluated. So they're calling this approach a variance test. So the variance test would ask the following questions. Does the variance align with the general intent of the municipal development plan, or in this case, the city plan? Does the variance request meet the general intent of the zoning bylaw by being consistent with the general purpose of the zone? Does the variance request unduly interfere with the amenities of the neighborhood or materially interfere with or affect the use, enjoyment, or value of neighboring properties? And does the variance request address a practical difficulty, such as a physical constraint of the site? So one thing it's important to note, the paper does discuss that at this time, administration is not proposing to remove the current restrictions on variances to maximum density, maximum floor area ratio, and maximum height. We will be keeping an eye on that, but essentially they just want to expand the criteria with which they can look at a variance request with. So there's some benefits and some drawbacks to this approach. The benefits are that the applicant would have to submit a justification for their variance request using the same criteria when it's requested by admin. And then the resulting review and decision by admin would be more rigorous because it would consider the merit of the variance in a more comprehensive manner, and it might give more clarity to the community about why a variance was or was not, or why a variance was approved. However, there might be less certainty for neighboring properties about what may or may not be an approved variance under this approach. So moving on to notifications. So the paper considers how residents and property owners are informed about two planning processes. The first, a rezoning application, which is when an applicant proposes changes to how land can be used. And the second, a development permit application, which is when projects are proposed to be built. So how do you hear about these two proposals? So for rezoning applications, the city sends a postcard notification to property owners surrounding the site at various stages of the review process. The first notice is sent after an application has been received and a sign is installed on the site for select applications. Then, if required, a second notice is sent as an invitation to a public information session. And finally, when the public hearing is scheduled for council to make a decision about the proposed rezoning, a final notice is sent and newspaper ads are published. So the city also keeps residents informed about development permit applications through a number of mediums. The first being through maintaining online databases with basic information about each development permit application and its status. And the second is when consultation is required because an applicant requests a variance in an area governed by an overlay like the mature neighborhood overlay we discussed earlier. So in those instances, consultation letters are sent to neighbors, community leagues, and business improvement areas for their input on the requested variance. And finally, sorry, I know this was a lot of information. There are two situations where administration will provide information after it's made a decision about a development permit application. So the two at the top here, these are provided before, and these two are provided after. So the Class A informational development permit is a notice that it's informational only and is intended to provide awareness of an approved development permit application. So these notifications don't allow for community input because they do follow all of the rules of the zoning bylaw, but they basically let you know development is coming. Here's some things to look out for. And then the second is a notification for what is called a Class B development permit. So these permits are issued for all projects granted variances or an approved discretionary use. This notification informs residents about what's being approved. And the difference between this notification and the Class A is that it describes options for neighbors to appeal the decision. So in addition to the letters, newspaper ads are also published about these decisions as well. So the paper does identify a number of issues with the current process for notifications. The first being that there's a really limited reach that publishing public hearing notices in the city paper allows for. So in 2014, the Edmonton Journal reached just 7% of the Edmonton population during the week, and there's no indication that these numbers have increased. So it raises questions about how many people are actually seeing that something is going to public hearing. The second is the cost the city spends on development permit notices, rezoning notices, and newspaper ads. In 2019, the city spent approximately $300,000 in newspaper ads and mailed notifications. And you'll recall that some of the notifications sent out by the city are informational only, meaning that neighbors don't have any right to an appeal or to provide comment. And finally, notices for development permits and rezonings are generally only sent out to property owners because that's what's mandated in the Municipal Government Act. But this means that if the property owner doesn't live on site and has a different mailing address, renters or people leasing the space may not be captured in the engagement, even though they're the ones that will be impacted by the development, which raises issues of fairness. So what exactly is being proposed? So first, installing on-site signage earlier in the process. At present, on-site signage for residential development is posted after the permit has been approved. However, it is proposed that these signs would be posted at the start of the application as opposed to at the end, so that residents living nearby benefit from earlier awareness of the project. And they would also like to allow residents to opt in to online notifications. And they also would like to improve the online mapping tool currently used to be more user-friendly. At present, the only thing that's being proposed to be phased out are newspaper ads. However, I do also want to bring up that on October 27th, there was a proposal that went before council to phase out those Class A development permit notifications that we talked about earlier, which, as I mentioned, are informational, but they still let neighbors know about development occurring in the community. And council basically said no, if they wanted to keep those. So that kind of gives maybe an indication about the notifications. Maybe their thought is that more is better so that people know what's going on in their communities, especially going forward as we see a little bit more densification pressures happening. All right, so that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us tonight and participating in discussion. What next? So you can head over to the Engage Edmonton platform and share your thoughts and look out for you can share your thoughts, you can read the full papers, and also I want you to be mindful that the EFCL will likely be reaching out to you in the coming months about next step for community league involvement in this project. So in the next few days, you can expect an email from me that will include the full slide deck, session recording, and any questions and answers that came up in the session. And if there's anything else that you want to talk about with regards to these proposals, I would really encourage you to respond to that email and ask me anything. I'm happy to chat or clear anything up that might have been unclear for you. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.